very good morning, good evening, for folks joining us in India. Uh, hey, Joe, welcome as well. And thank you, as always, for joining us for our second edition of the Indo-Pacific Security Dialogues. It's only the second time we're putting this together, and, we're talking about all things Indo-Pacific, all things related to all Indo-Pacific security. And what a propitious time to be talking about this, just as Prime Minister Modi visited the United States and visited Delaware, where he met with President Biden and Prime Minister Kishida and Prime Minister Albanese, and of course addressed diaspora summit in New York City. And I feel that right now is the best time to discuss this because as President Biden and Prime Minister Modi underscored the shared interests of both Washington and New Delhi, they discuss how the countries can collaborate on the urgent challenges of the 21st century, from security to supply chains to semiconductors to space to clean energy, healthcare, vaccine, and even a cancer moonshot. So, just to unpack the Sixth Quad Leader Summit and the outcomes of President Biden and Prime Minister Modi's bilateral discussion, and of course, the recently concluded INDUS-X 3.0, I am delighted to be joined by four very heavy hitters, and they're not just academic and think tank scholars, but they're foreign policy and national security practitioners who, apart from this expertise in the subject, they have played key roles at the highest echelons of US India policy planning, defense planning, and all things Indo Pacific. And I think but just between the four of them, they have experience on the National Security Council, the CIA, the State Department, Department of Defense, Capitol Hill. They put together Indus X 3.0. And if that's not enough, they have tons of publication and research material out there. So that means they need very little introduction. But formality dictates I do have to introduce my panel. Firstly, my colleague Vikram Singh. From USISPF. So thank you, Vikram. Glad you're finally in from the waiting room, out of the waiting room and into the fire right now. Samir Lalwani from the United States Institute of Peace, joining us all the from the other side of the country, Dr. Joe Felter from the Gordon North Center, as well as the Hoover Institution in Stanford University, and Lisa Curtis, right here, who heads Indo-Pacific for CNAS. So thank you to the four of you, and apologies again for the delay this morning. So I do want to caveat these conversations are being recorded and will be available later on USISPF's platform. So in case there's something you missed, we can always watch it later on. I'm going to start with a few questions and feel free to type in your questions in the chat box and we'll try to get to as many as we can in the limited amount of time frame that we have. So Lisa, I wanted to start with you. In the annals of US-India bilateral ties, obviously Prime Minister Modi's state visit of 2023 is right up there. And the Wilmington Declaration may play second fiddle, but it's equally significant in moving the needle forward on the bilateral relationship, especially from the policy outcomes we had from last year. So, Lisa, having worked on the Indo-Pacific strategic framework from your time in government and expanding on Quad cooperation, you're looking at it from outside government. So, fair to say the report card, the progress reads very well, doesn't it?
Yes, I think this was a very important meeting. I think, the Quad meeting was really about President Biden's legacy. He was the one who elevated the Quad to the leader level. There's been a Quad leader level meeting every year over the last 4 years. And so this really was about him showcasing the progress that the Quad has made under his watch. But it's also important to remember that the Quad was revived after a 10-year hiatus during the Trump administration in 2017. So I think, this shows that the Quad has bipartisan support. And so no matter who is elected in November in the United States, I think we can be rest assured that the Quad will continue. And I think, it was very apt that the last statement of the joint statement was the Quad is here to stay. And indeed, it is here to stay. And I think, that seems very clear. So I think that, this was important. I would say that the most significant announcement coming out of the Quad meeting was really the commitment to hold the Maritime Observer mission. This is very significant because it comes at a time when we're really seeing unprecedented Chinese maritime aggression, particularly in the South China Sea, but not only the South China Sea. Just 2 weeks ago, a Chinese aircraft carrier and two destroyers sailed in Japan's contiguous zone in the East China Sea. And this prompted Japan to say that the move was unacceptable. And so this was a big deal. This shows that China is continuing with this aggressive behavior, aggressive maritime behavior. And of course, we've all seen what's been happening in the South China Sea, the repeated acts of Chinese maritime aggression against the Philippines. Most recently, in late August, when a Chinese vessel collided with a Philippine ship near Sabina Shoal. So I think that, the announcement of this maritime observer mission is a signal to China that its maritime bullying won't be tolerated, that this coalition of like-minded nations is going to come together, not just with statements, but also with action. And I think this was very important. So, even though really the Quad meeting was about the legacy, of President Biden and what he's done with the Quad, there was also some very important new initiatives that were put forward and that, I believe will be carried forward in 2025, no matter who's elected in November.
Yeah. Thanks again, Lisa. And I'm going to have Joe and Samir unpack that before I do, but I'll get to Vikram. Vikram, I know you have a time crunch, but I think looking forward, we also have looking back at the same time as well. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme, because we go back and when President Biden first took office, within months, March 2021, he convened the first Quad Leaders Summit in a virtual format. Then in September 2021, this time 3 years ago, the first in-person Quad Leaders Summit in the middle of a raging pandemic on the sidelines of UNGA. And now, just months before bowing out as commander in chief, he had the signature touch by convening, the other three leaders at his home in Delaware. So there's a lot to unpack on Biden's legacy, but on this issue, he does leave a very, a high report card to look forward to. And as Lisa touched on, the four have never been more strategically aligned, both in the Indo-Pacific and the economic framework, and it's sort of a Beijing containment strategy, right?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks. It's good to be here with friends, and it's a pretty exciting end to the Biden's term with how much has been done on the Quad. And I think, in the future, you're going to see people from the Trump administration and the Biden administration are all going to be competing to take credit for elevating and making the Quad into what it's become. And that's a good competition to have. We should all keep building on what these guys have achieved. Yeah, I think Joe Biden, I think it's the first time he's hosted foreign leaders at his home. So it does have a certain touchstone feeling. It does have a feeling of putting a personal stamp on it. But I also think, they had to do some gymnastics to get here. India was in theory supposed to host this year, and they came up with a good idea, which was to do a swap. So India swaps with the U.S. for next year, so that the U.S. could host it this year, and it could actually not miss the year and could be done before the election happens. And I think one of the reasons they really wanted to do that was permanence, institutionalization, making sure that, as Lisa said, this is something that will continue and endure. And then, to the framing of your question, I would push back a little bit on the containment narrative. I know that's a big part, and I'm glad you're going to tackle it in this webinar and let everyone talk to that. I mean, the Quad and a lot of the other innovations you're seeing in minilateral cooperation in the region are certainly aimed at competition. I just don't know that they're aimed at containment. They're aimed at providing alternatives to countries throughout this region to ensure that they have choices in their engagements, in their diplomatic, political, economic, military partnerships. That is the essence of a free and open Indo-Pacific, which, although that's a phrase that was coined by Prime Minister Abe, the late Prime Minister Abe, a long time ago, it's really been adopted across the board throughout the region. And it's, in essence, what folks want to see, and what folks are concerned that Beijing may have different ideas. And I think what we've seen in recent years, and the reason you see this continuity of policy across multiple administrations, is that certainly in the Xi Jinping era, Beijing does intend to change the global order in ways that we, and I think folks throughout the region, see as worrying. And it is doing that, as Lisa rightly pointed to, the most aggressive ways, again, ramming ships in well within another country's own EEZ, which is behavior that is, it's actually kind of stunning to me that it gets so little attention, because it is such brutish and inappropriate behavior. It has no place in international in the international arena among states who are, not in conflict, right? You don't go ramming your neighbor's vessels, even if you have a territorial dispute or disagreement. And then throwing a lot of propaganda out there to suggest that the Philippines are somehow instigating this by being, by sailing through their own EEZ, 50, 60, 70 miles off of their coast and several hundred miles off of the Chinese coast. And I think that kind of norms, those kinds of principles, that's what the Quad is partly standing up for, in addition to all the affirmative programming. Lisa mentioned the Cancer Moonshot. There's stuff in climate. There's stuff in maritime security. There's a whole host of areas: humanitarian relief, disaster response, climate resilience. These are things that are needed for the four countries and for the region. And I think the affirmative competition is what they want folks to take away, and what we want to see continuing going forward. The Quad is competing for helping the region be strong and prosperous and stable.
Thanks, Vikram. I'm going to take your point forward to Samir. I like the way everyone's building on each other's points, and I think we're going to get group consensus here among the four Quad experts, the four of you. Samir, Vikram says, it's competition, not containment. And, going back again to that 2021, that historic first ever Quad in-person four leaders meeting, there was still a talk of, is the Quad an Asian NATO? Is it a security grouping? Because of a lot of Beijing's belligerence and the tempestuous environment we witnessed in the South China Sea. But I think with every Quad statement, particularly this one, from the highlight of the cancer moonshot, pandemics, enhancing maritime domain awareness, physical infrastructure, semiconductors, and climate, there's evidence that it's far from a security pact, and it may not be self-aggrandizing to say the Quad is, a force for good. But that being said, given some of the concerns that Lisa and Vikram have highlighted on the security, how should the Quad sort of balance between, broader economic impact for Indo-Pacific nations, as well as a sort of security umbrella for this free and open Indo-Pacific?
Well, thanks for the question. And I just want to say as a caveat that I have not worked on the Quad like my other colleagues here on this panel, so I can speak freely about just my personal opinion on what my assessment of it is. And I would say that you're right to say this is not a security pact, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have security implications. And I think that's actually quite an important distinction. It has security implications, it has strategic implications, because ultimately what the Quad is about, as I see it, is pooling instruments of power, right? Pooling technology or technology capabilities, economic power, information power, both the ability to detect as well as to inform and to provide intelligence, and even military capabilities that are used for public security goods. All these things are forms of power that will have security implications. They result in, as Vikram said, competition with China. But the purpose, I think, in bringing this together as a foursome in the Quad is to coordinate so that we're not replicating or competing with each other, right? We sort of have a shared vision of what a free and open Indo-Pacific should look like, and it would be to our detriment for these investments, these trainings, these public goods, these security measures to work at cross purposes or not be coordinated so they can maximize impact. And I do think that while, again, this Quad is not a security pact, one of the objectives, in my opinion, is to counter Chinese coercion that has been evident in playing out militarily, economically, diplomatically for at least a decade or so. Economic instruments of the Quad, these public goods, are about creating alternative sources of economic dynamism and resilience that will provide an alternative to whether it's Belt and Road Initiative or Global Security Initiative or some Global Development Initiative. And then similarly, as China's naval, coast guard, and maritime militias have built up to enormous levels and are engaged in various reckless and aggressive behavior, there's an importance to bolster our partners in providing the ability to detect some of these activities, some of the dark shipping that we see, some of the illegal fishing that we see, and some of the reckless and aggressive behavior. So I think the investments that were notified, like that are noticed in the Quad, like the Coast Guard, like kind of Coast Guard Rider program or the May 3 initiative, that's going to be a training program. Those are going to help backstop the partners on top of what has already been implemented with the Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness Initiative as well.
No, thanks, Samir. And just like the Indo-Pacific, speak freely and openly. So, Joe, you're coming still still have INDUS-X still on your mind, having put that together along with, Vikram and Samir here. And one thing that the Quad's always been consistent about is this sort of rejigging and rebuilding supply chains, because the pandemic showed us that supply chain disrupted in China cannot mean supply chain disrupt around the world. And on the U.S. India front, both Washington and New Delhi are committed to investing in this high end semiconductor fabs and boosting India's manufacturing potential. And it also adds to Washington's priorities of friendshoring under this national security umbrella. Joe, from your days at the Pentagon, there's a sort of a shift in erstwhile defense relationship that you probably first saw when you first got into it, like from just a buyer seller based model to one that's now we're seeing on co-production, co-development, and sort of transfer of technology.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks for a chance to join us. Great to see some friends. Great to see back out here on the left coast, Vikram, Samir, and Akshobh. Lisa, hoping you can come out here soon. We missed you. Yeah, actually, so to your point, I would say that this the road to co-production development, it's in transfer tech, it's been a long road, and it's been challenging. And folks like Vikram, when he was serving, and certainly Lisa in the last administration, made a lot of progress to helping the relationship move in that direction. A lot of positive developments. Vikram went back, certainly the Major Defense Partnership designation, early enabling agreement, the LAMOA, some big wins there, set things up, and maybe piling on to Lisa's point, the last administration did really move the ball significantly in the right direction, as has this current one. Passing the other enabling agreements, we really set the conditions, I think, for this road to co-production and development that you described there, Akshobh, with the COMCASA, the ISA, the PECA, and others. But hey, we've got barriers, regulations that are created by, I think, both our respective bureaucracies. It's going to continue to challenge tech cooperation and collaboration that we really need. And we all saw, high hopes for DTTI, Defense Technology Trade Initiative. Let's not give up on it, but I think we all have to acknowledge that it has not quite lived up to what we'd hoped for. Encourage, I think, the initiative on critical emerging technologies that I said, that's a great initiative, and let's hope that helps advance and move the ball in tech cooperation. And certainly I said in particular, maybe a sensitive topic. Let's hope that those types of initiatives can help wean India off of its dependence on defense manufacturing, and from certain countries, I won't name them, i.e. Russia, would be great to think to wean themselves from. But I think these restrictions on the transfer of technology by the U.S. is also a big problem. We still make this distinction between transfers to allies and non-allies. I would just say, let's finish on, this is a catchphrase I used to use when I was serving in the DoD with Lisa across the river. Let's put the M in the MDP. If we're going to call it a major defense partnership, let's make it real. Let's make it work both ways. Let's find ways to share this technology, and really create even more incentives for this collaboration to work both ways, and to move down that road towards co-production and co-development and tech transfer that we really need to really realize the full potential of the relationship.
I do think that Joe just hit on something really important, which is, I think it's increasingly evident that none of us are going to be able to recapitalize and build up our defense industrial bases adequately alone. And so the idea of allied and partner defense innovation base, and while we'll still have companies competing with each other, more partnership, and recognizing that most of our military systems, American systems have stuff from European partners and vice versa, and that's something that's been just a business thing. It has to become a strategic element of how we're all moving forward together in a contested 21st century with lots of large investments being made. And so Joe's really hitting on something important. We're talking about it for India, but it's the motions of it are there in, say, AUKUS, where we have reformed export controls. But I think we tie ourselves in too many knots still to be able to really do what you do. And I would hate to see us only cut through those knots, Gordian knot, as Joe, says, as they focus on these hard challenges. But I'd hate to see us only cut through that knot when we have a crisis, because a lot of times what does happen is the innovations that you need are only possible because you're in a war or a conflict or a disaster. And I hope we can get ahead of a lot of that. And I apologize, I'll disappear sometime in the next question. Thank you very much. It's great to see everybody.
I was going to give you a curveball, Vikram, for you to hit out of the park. Do you have time to hit one out of the park?
Sure, go ahead.
All right, so Vikram, Joe sort of touched on, LAMOA, COMCASA, and I just want to take you back to that meeting when Rajnath Singh, the Indian Defense Minister, visited Washington. You were there. Obviously, the first visit by a minister in Modi 3.0. Along with Lemoa, Comcast, and Becca, we saw SOSA. I wanted to ask you, does SOSA already add on to these existing agreements? And two is, how do you see SOSA bolstering supply chain cooperation on the defense front, since you just touched on some of the issues right now in supply chains as
Yeah,
well?
I can't remember security of supply arrangement. I can't remember how many countries we have them with. Somebody else on the panel might remember, maybe 15, 16, 17, something like that. It basically means we'll preference each other especially in a crisis. So if you suddenly need more, let's say, artillery because you have a conflict, or you need cold weather gear or small arms, that we have the ability to ask our industry to give preference to a partner. And it's an arrangement, it's a voluntary agreement for the companies involved, but it's a sign of the priority we place on the relationship and the level of mutual commitment we have to each other. And it goes both ways. So we would also be able to ask India in the future to prioritize Indian supplies to us in a crisis. So I think it does build on, Joe talked through it nicely. And really, during Joe and Lisa's time in government, the vast majority of these agreements and arrangements were brought to conclusion. So the foundation for a really ambitious U.S.-India defense partnership is really in place.
Lisa, Joe mentioned about your time in government, and I just wanted to kind of take you back to that, because you started working on this relationship long before the fruits of labor have been seen, long before it became seen as a strategic partnership, major defense partner. But if you could go back in history and just sort of pin down, when do you think Washington made this kind of conscientious shift from once focusing on transatlantic relation to now prioritizing Indo-Pacific and the littoral states? Because yes, to an extent, of course, China's rise in the last decade, but what were the other salient factors that led to this pivot to Asia? And we saw Indo-Pacific take precedence under Trump 1.0, an administration that you're part of, and now further fructified under President Biden. So if you wear your policy hat again, the next administration could be a Trump 2.0, could be a Harris administration, would build on this and elevate it to keep it sort of a sacrosanct to U.S. national security, right?
Well, thanks, Akshobh. Great question. Really, there's been a sort of gradual shift to the Indo-Pacific region, and frankly, I think it's pretty impressive to see how the Biden administration has been able to continue a focus on the Indo-Pacific, continue moving forward with initiatives. Everything from the Quad to the trilateral between US, Japan, and South Korea, the historic meeting that happened last year at Camp David with that. The Philippines, that relationship has moved forward, and the continued focus on export controls and seeking to ensure the highest end semiconductor technology, that there are restrictions on that to China. You could point to several different elements of this Indo-Pacific strategy that have continued despite other major crises happening. Russia's invasion of Ukraine starting in February 2022, over 2 years ago. The Middle East crisis, which started just about a year ago. So despite these very serious other global crises that the United States has to deal with, I think there has remained a steadfast focus on the Indo-Pacific. So the Biden administration gets credit for that, because I think when there was first this recognition, probably going back about 15 years ago, during the Obama administration and its desire to pivot toward Asia. But that really didn't happen. And there were some mistakes made in terms of China's militarization of artificial islands in the South China Sea that was not properly dealt with. You'll even hear Kirk Campbell admitting that now during the Obama administration. So the Asia pivot really, even though the vision was there, the actuality of it happening, it just didn't really happen. During the Trump administration, I think there was a focus on the Indo-Pacific from the beginning, and the Indo-Pacific strategic framework. We were focused on developing that going back to 2017, the first year of the Trump administration. And by February 2018, former President Trump had signed off on the Indo-Pacific strategic framework. Part of that framework involved enhancing Quad cooperation. That was one of the major pieces of that framework. So I think, that there has been a gradual turn toward the Indo-Pacific. And, there can be a case made that it didn't happen soon enough, not enough happened soon enough, but here we are. And I think the good news is that that focus is going to stay there, no matter who is elected in November. Look, former President Trump has talked about China in almost every political rally that he has held. And, so I think it's clear that, if Trump was potentially elected for a second term, there would remain a strong focus on China, on the Indo-Pacific, pursuing Quad cooperation. And, we can't forget that, in fact, it was during the Trump administration where it was really brought to light the dangers of relying on Chinese 5G technology. And the Trump administration in 2018 implemented the first export controls on Huawei and ZTE. Now, of course, the Biden administration has strengthened export controls, particularly regarding high-end semiconductor technology. And, I think we would see this continue if Harris was elected. And, Kamala Harris has made important visits to Asia. She went to the swearing-in ceremony for President Marcos Jr. She hosted Modi at the Tech Handshake event last year when he visited for his state visit to the United States. She was involved in the visit of Australian Prime Minister Albanese, also with the Kishida visit. So, I think we are kind of past the point of no return when it comes to focusing on the Indo-Pacific. And if we could continue that focus and continue the initiatives amidst a Russian-Ukraine war and a Middle East crisis, then I think, it's clear that we can continue this focus moving forward into 2025 and beyond.
Thanks, Lisa. I mean, so the message is the Indo-Pacific is here to stay. Samir, just shifting focus from the sea to the skies a little. At INDUS-X, General Whiting of the U.S. Space Force brought up a significant milestone, India's commitment to join the Artemis Accords. And, just going over the Artemis Accords recently, there's sort of a Indo-Pacific framework in that there's the overarching theme of safe, peaceful, and prosperous future, albeit in space. The joint statement also mentioned space cooperation. There's historical efforts of NASA and ISRO collaborating, and there's talks about joint efforts at the International Space Station. But I just wanted to understand, in New Delhi's policy framework, New Delhi normally has been reticent to join US-led multilateral initiatives. So where was the shift on the thinking on space? Is it just the tech benefits of technology transfer, and technology sharing, and just broader, commercial space economy that sort of was the pushing point for or pivot for India to join the Artemis?
Yeah, so I would maybe challenge the premise of the question just a little bit and say that, while it is a notable breakthrough in terms of India signing on to the Artemis Accords last year during Prime Minister Modi's historic visit to Washington, and there's been sort of increasing collaboration between our public sectors and private sectors. India is growing more comfortable with just a broader array of multilateral initiatives. And here, I'll footstep not only some of the things that were mentioned in the Quad statement, or in the U.S.-India bilateral statement that came around the time of the Quad. So India's aspirations and plans to take over a task force in the Combined Maritime Force. This is something that it was unfathomable 5 years ago or so. And now India is sort of proceeding to not only join the CMF as an auxiliary member and then a full-time member, but now start to take on leadership roles of the task force that's charged ultimately about maritime security in the Indian Ocean, the Western Indian Ocean, an area that is critical to both U.S. and Indian and frankly even Chinese interests. So I think India is stepping up a lot. In the space domain, India joined this AD3 Advanced Domain Dialogue between U.S. and India, and it was public record they had a space tabletop exercise this spring in their last meeting. So I think while India sort of has this historic framework and language of non-alignment, it's increasingly countenancing, leveraging its partnerships in sort of a multi-alignment approach. It doesn't have to make sort of, arm-tying commitments, but it's willing to play and contribute more into a broader multinational space. And just to think about the sort of specifically General Whiting's comments, as the leader of U.S. Space Command, he really actually name-checked Indian space companies in his speech there at the INDUS-X summit. I was really impressed to hear that he referenced companies that are working on space situational awareness, on satellite production, and that's sort of on top of all the Indian companies that I've personally sort of witnessed that are working in the space of launch, in-orbit servicing, propulsion. So there's just this vibrant and tremendous Indian commercial space industry that is an opportunity for both the U.S. industry as well as the U.S. Defense Department. Our U.S. National Reconnaissance Office has a public contract with an Indian hyperspectral imaging company. And so we're benefiting from sort of that intelligence and data gathering right now as we speak. I think that the U.S. is going to look to India more in this space for sourcing capabilities, for this commercial augmentation strategy, to lean more on commercial sources for space resilience. And you mentioned this is turning to a new domain to space, but ultimately, or increasingly, the space domain is becoming very important to both detect and protect the maritime domain. So you see the interconnection between these two domains. India is becoming an increasingly important partner in this technology space. There's a NASA ISRO synthetic aperture radar that's planning to be launched very soon. And while there are parts of the Indian public sector dual-use defense establishment that have lagged a little bit in terms of innovation, ISRO is not one of them. It's the institution that led India to be the fourth country to land a spacecraft on the moon last year in 2023, and they did it probably for about a tenth of the budget that most modern Western countries have done. So there's really novel innovation that the U.S. can benefit from. This is not sort of a one-directional partnership. And then obviously sort of the talent that exists in the Indian commercial and public sector space industry is of great interest to U.S. partnerships as well.
And thanks for that, Samir. Joe, Samir just touched on some of the innovation that's happening in the space tech thing, and that's a good segue to your area of expertise, because you're the co-creator of Hacking for Defense along with Steve Blank. And for those unaware, it's a defense innovation focused academic curriculum sponsored by DoD. Joe, I'll have you add on more about Hacking for Defense. But as we touched on earlier, like the Overton window obviously has changed to address emerging threats, in security challenges. Therefore, ISET and the third edition of INDUS-X was so vital. And of course, it got a mention in the joint statement. So congratulations to you, Vikram, Samir, and all the others who worked on it. So right now, obviously, the priority is that the governments have outlined are AI, quantum, biotech. And this is sort of now reframing the national security decision-making and sacrosanct. So I wanted to touch on how you look at Hacking for Defense and, sort of mentor the next generation of defense thinkers, because when you kind of got through the ropes of the defense world, it was still thinking about bipolar world with the US and the Soviet Union and great power competition. That great power competition has changed today in the tech sphere, as Samir touched on some of the aspects, right?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Akshobh. And I'll just start off by saying, it's a different world than I unlike my students in class, I remember the Cold War. And I think it's safe to say that the U.S. and our allies and partners prevailed in that Cold War, but it was, as far as defense relevant technology that helped us prevail in that last conflict, or not conflict, in that last competition, if you will. There are, if we could build a better, large end system, like a better aircraft carrier, submarine, fighter jet every 10 years or so, we could remain competitive. We could prevail in that Cold War competition, and our acquisitions and requirements, everything was set up in the Pentagon to win the Cold War, and sadly we're still configured to win the Cold War. But thanks for letting me promote a little bit of Hacking for Defense. But Hacking for Defense was inspired by a couple things. One is this recognition that the defense relevant technologies that's going to determine whether we prevail in this current competition that we've been talking about today. Those technologies are coming not out of government labs, not even out of big defense primes, but out of the the commercial sector. It's the technology you just described. The AI, the autonomy, the cyber, so many of those technologies. And importantly, advances in those technologies aren't going to be driven by government directives, but by consumer demand. But we need to configure ourselves and create the right incentives and create the right pathways to be able to really identify and adopt and deploy those technologies at speed and scale. And I think having INDUS-X out at Silicon Valley and at Stanford, I think is a great acknowledgement of where the fight is, where I shouldn't say the fight, where the competition really is, the emerging technologies that we need that are going to determine whether we prevail or not in this ongoing competition. It's those commercial technologies. And piling onto that, not only do we need to be, and we have made great efforts to try to do that, the Defense Innovation Unit and its counterpart IDEX, all the service accelerators, the AFWorks, SoftWorks, NavalX, many others. But we do have a long way to go. But if I could pile onto the hacking for defense question there, back when I was commissioned in the military at the very tail end of the Cold War, it still dates me significantly. There's still that some of our best and brightest coming out of places like Stanford, MIT, and our top universities. They were still attracted to go work for, the NSA, the other government agencies. That's kind of where where some real opportunities to attract our best and brightest. I tell you, I'm at Stanford now. The incentives for our best and brightest engineers, computer scientists to go down the street and work at a tech company or do a startup are huge. The incentives to go work for the government are less so. So hacking for defense was really developed as a means to try to create more and better opportunities to get our best and brightest students a chance to serve, a chance to get engaged. They may not want to join a government agency or the military, but boy, they'll lend their incredible talent and intellect to work on a defense national security challenge, whether it's for a quarter, for a year, or go do an internship, or maybe actually find a way to serve for a bit. Yeah, that's the world we're in. And again, I think having INDUS-X out here in Silicon Valley was a great acknowledgement. I think that this is where the competition's going to really be determined. And going forward, and maybe we can talk to this later before we get cut off, that's really where we need to focus. It's not DC, Delhi, but kind of, maybe Bangalore, Silicon Valley. But back over to you, Akshobh.
No, yeah, Joe, that's definitely coming up in the louder part as well. And I can probably throw to Samir, given he was so involved with INDUS-X. But I want to get to you, Lisa, because you touched on the Philippines. And, while there's sort of euphoria on the current Quad leaders visit, and that's going to obviously continue for the rest of the year, I wanted your take how the Quad is different from the Squad with the grouping with the Philippines. I mean, yes, the Indo-Pacific has two distinct components, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. Perhaps from two perspectives, is Washington looking at the Pacific Ocean more for the Squad and AUKUS more of the security component, while India with its domain does the Quad with more of the heavy lifting in the Indian Ocean and some of the economic aspect? And perhaps also if you could add light on how New Delhi is looking at the Squad, because in a lot of ways it's Quad minus India plus Philippines. So I'm just curious how this fits into the larger Indo-Pacific framework.
Well, I don't think I agree that the Quad is only focused or mainly even focused on the Indian Ocean. If you just look at the joint statement coming out of Wilmington, there are so many issues that are raised, global issues, global hotspots, North Korea, Myanmar, other issues. There are so many functional issues, infrastructure, technology, climate change, health. So I think, we can't think of the Quad as focused mainly on the Indian Ocean, while AUKUS and the Squad might be focused on the Pacific. I think that would be a wrong way to look at it. Now, of course, I believe that there should be more focus on the Indian Ocean, both within the Quad, but also in the bilateral relationship between India and the United States. And I was very heartened to hear Kurt Campbell announce that there would be an Indian Ocean dialogue, bringing in, the interagency of both governments to discuss this important issue. And of course, the Quad joint statement that just came out from Wilmington also has a paragraph on the Indian Ocean region, talks about the importance of IORA and India's leadership role within that organization. So I think the Indian Ocean region is very important. It's coming more into play in Quad discussions, and it's going to come more into play in the India-US bilateral dialogue. And I really think that's overdue, because we've seen that China is expanding its naval presence in the Indian Ocean over really the last 15 to 20 years. It's investing in strategic ports throughout the region. It's docking dual-use vessels in Sri Lanka and the Maldives, right in India's backyard. So there is some worrisome behavior. Of course, it's not to the degree that we see in the South China Sea. China does not make, illegal maritime claims yet in the Indian Ocean region, but it still merits our attention and monitoring. And look, I think in terms of the Squad and India's view of the Squad, I think there may be some pressure on India. India may feel some pressure to address security or defense issues a bit more in the Quad. And I think, for two reasons. The first, India wouldn't want to be left out of the security architecture that is evolving in the Indo-Pacific. And, this is AUKUS, Squad, the trilateral with Japan and South Korea that I mentioned, the trilateral between US, Japan, Philippines. So I think that, this could put some pressure on India to be more willing to discuss defense and security issues in the Quad, maybe even to allow a defense ministers meeting. That's been something that India has put down as a red line. It has not wanted the Quad defense ministers to meet, even though the naval chiefs usually meet at the Raisina dialogue. They're on a joint panel. But in terms of, an official defense ministers meeting, this has been something that India has not wanted to do up to this point. So I do think the Squad put some indirect pressure on India in that way. But also, I think just China's increasing aggression, we've talked about the South China Sea. I think that also kind of raises the need for the Quad to focus more on security issues, defense and security issues. And, New Delhi has certainly become more vocal about its support for the Philippines' position, its support for the 2016 Hague arbitral ruling on the South China Sea. And in fact, that's part of the Quad joint statement as well. And just the language itself in this most recent Quad statement is a bit sharper than we have seen in the past, really, pointing out the need to respect country sovereignty and freedom of the seaways, and talking about serious concerns in the South China Sea. So I think, all of this shows that India recognizes the need to make sure that the Quad is not just about economics and technology, right? I think there has to be a bit of a security element, maybe not, to the extent of the defense ministers meeting together. But I think, gradually it may move in that direction. And the Squad sort of puts some pressure on India to think about that or consider that if it wants to be part of this evolving security architecture. And just one last word on this evolving security architecture.
Yep.
I think we need to make sure that it is not just ad hoc meetings, that there has to be some strategy behind all of this. It's nice to think about a lattice work. And of course, there's never going to be an Asian NATO. But I think we need something in between that. I think we do need a bit of structure to what the US is doing so that it all adds up to something that really contributes to deterrence and ensures, peace and security in the Indo-Pacific. And I think it's important to have an Indo-Pacific coordinator at the White House. I think Kurt Campbell played a very important role. He was not replaced, but I think whoever's elected, Harris or Trump, should consider seriously having a senior Indo-Pacific coordinator at the White House that can kind of bring this lattice work of arrangements and minilaterals and multilaterals together for a coherent strategy.
No,
Lisa, that
thank you for
sounds like
that.
a great job for you. I think we
Yeah, I was going to say the same. Yeah,
got a
Or
I
really
was going.
you.
I would say any of our four panelists, so if there's any one listening and from the future administration, please, this is your vetting pool right here. Samir, Lisa just touched on some of the tensions as well in the South China Sea, and I wanted to kind of shift a little bit to the Taiwan Strait. Several analogies have kind of been drawn with, Taiwan's size and vulnerability with Ukraine, particularly after February 2022, as Russia sort of marched into Ukraine like 1939, and the concerns with China sort of, increasing its bellicosity there. Apart from just a security conflict in that part of the world, there's also vulnerability given Taiwan's hub as supply chains and for semiconductors, TSMC. And in our first edition of the Indo-Pacific webinar, we had a Japan journalist here and who gave us his views of how Tokyo sees it, given the proximity that they share to that region. So, how do you look at the current tensions right now in that part of the world, given both the security aspect and the bottlenecks that it could create on semiconductor supply chains?
Yeah, so specifically with respect to the threat posed by China to Taiwan and what that means for India's economic and strategic security, and I think it's been written about, and talked about increasingly in the last 2 years. You see a really important paper by the former Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale detailing what the consequences would be for India. That would not just be sort of the general consequences of a conflict in the Pacific or in the Indo-Pacific, but very acute consequences for India's services economy and software services economy, because if undersea cables were to be cut in this conflict, which seems of like a high likelihood given the nature of the war that would sort of take place there, it would have immediate impacts and disastrous impacts on India's services economy, which is sort of one of the largest sources of foreign exchange. So immediately, I think India has to be attentive to this, not only because what we learned from the Russia-Ukraine war in 2022, where everyone gets drawn in, but certain countries will be acutely exposed. I mean, the second, I think, is a little bit more of a strategic consideration, which you see India wrestling with, which is what happens the day after if China is successful? And there you are seeing greater and greater interest by the Indian military and what the consequences of such an event could be. And also sort of what are Indian contingency plans. So again, you see a public report last summer about the Chief of Defense Staff ordering a study of those contingencies and sort of Indian response options. Now, this is early stages, and this is only what we're seeing in the public, but I think it's a meaningful sign that India will have increasing stakes in cross-strait stability going forward. You see greater economic states building up between the two, between Taiwan and India, whether it's for labor supply, technology cooperation, investments in India in microelectronics or other high-end electronics. So I think more and more India is becoming exposed to the problem, and as a result is becoming much more willing to work with, I think, the U.S. and partners in thinking about those scenarios. Now, it's early days, and I think it's not something that sort of happens a lot in the public domain, but there are enough signs, from my opinion, to say that I think India sees that risk and is starting to take some actions and willing to be a little bit more forward-leaning when it comes to that. And that's probably what also animates a lot of its efforts in the critical technology space. I mean, obviously, as sort of being an alternative supplier and source of resilience in semiconductor supply chains, but also when it comes to a host of other sort of, security initiatives in the Indo-Pacific.
Thanks for that, Samir. I mean, and on some of the supply chains thing as well. Joe, obviously, you touched on, when we first spoke on Indus-X and on this, you mentioned it's sort of a back to the future for Silicon Valley, right? Going back to the military industrial complex that made Silicon Valley, it gave its initial boom in the 1950s. I think somehow we forgot about it in all the ride-hailing apps and social media and commercial technology, but you kind of bring it back to how commercial technology is driving military innovation. And given Indus-X is both futuristic, but also infant in its program, right? It's only the third edition. How does DIU and IDEX build on this, given the MOU that was signed and obviously mentioned in the joint statement? And on one hand, Vikram, and you have mentioned, Bangalore for the next edition, taking these programs away from just Washington and Delhi and taking it to these hubs like we did in Silicon Valley and now perhaps at Bangalore. So how do you see DIU and IDEX build on this?
Akshobh, great. And again, I was there in 2018 when Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, the Minister of Defense for India, was waiving the DIU IDEX memorandum of basically cooperation to move forward. So we started there, and but a lot of enthusiasm. I went back with Raj Shah, then the DIU director, later that year, and pushed on it. DIU right now is making great progress with its counterpart, IDEX. That Doug Beck's counterpart was with him here in Stanford here a couple weeks back. I went to Delhi actually with Doug last year. So a lot of momentum, but we gotta get some wins. And I know that you look at DTDI, bigger, larger ends at the smaller startup level, we can get some wins. Let's help. Let's use IDEX and DIU to get those early wins in tech cooperation. But totally agree with Vikram and your point on focus on the tech hubs. We need DC or Washington's and Delhi's political support to keep things going, but the real roll up your sleeves and get work done and make progress, I think it's going to happen in the Bangalores and the San Jose's, Silicon Valleys, where I'm at currently. So let's get the political conditions set for progress, which we need given our respective bureaucracies. But then let's get out of the way. Let's let that cooperate. And actually, you were here at INDUS-X. You saw that thirst for collaboration and cooperation at the startup level. No, those individual startup founders here, they wanted to get after it. They just didn't want any restrictions, constraints, frictions. They wanted to move forward. And I think that DIU and IDEX could be the agile, nimble organizations to help steer that, representing their respective governments. But let's get out of the way. Let's create the right incentives, build the right field, which I think we have. And let's make some progress. I think it's going to build on itself rapidly. And we talked about maybe a future INDUS-X being hosted in Bangalore. And I think that would be a great example of an acknowledgement of where the real progress is going to be made or not.
Yeah. Who better to know how to disrupt than Silicon Valley, right? Disrupt the existing systems. And I want to take one of the questions that's come in. Lisa, the first one's been addressed to you. And the second one's addressed to Vikram, which either Samir, Joe, both of you can answer, or the group can answer it. It says, Lisa, you mentioned in the past that the Quad is not a security pact, but given the primary discussion is always a containment of China, tomorrow if push comes to shove, how will the containment be executed by the Quad? So Lisa, that's for you.
Okay, well, I think Vikram talked about how he doesn't agree with the idea that the Quad is about containment of China, that it's about competing more effectively with China. I think I agree with him 90%, but I think we've got to be clear that there is an interest in seeing China curb some of its recent maritime aggression in the South China Sea, East China Sea. And so when the Quad joint statement talks about, serious concerns about what's happening in these areas, that in a sense is trying to curb China's aggressive behavior. I don't know if contain is the right word, but I think that it is about trying to encourage China to respect international global norms, to respect the sovereignty of other nations, and to not allow China to be able to upset the global order and the standards, the international standards that are already there, already set, because clearly that's what China is seeking to do. And if you look at China's increasing cooperation with Russia, you can see that is the goal is to undermine U.S. global power and influence, to sort of upset the global order as we know it. And which benefits all four Quad countries, India included. So I think that, the statements are good. Statements are always good. Action is better. And that's why I think this joint maritime initiative that was announced by the four, and, the four navies, going to board, or the Coast Guard's going to board a U.S. Coast Guard ship, and they're going to work together, even though it hasn't been indicated where exactly this is going to happen, this observer mission. I think it's important that that this moves forward. So I think we'll see more and more initiatives like this. I'll repeat what I said before. It may be a bridge too far to expect India to agree for the Quad defense ministers to meet. However, I think there is Indian openness to maritime security initiatives, and that India realizes that if you allow China to get away with the kind of maritime aggression that it's starting to practice in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, that it's only a matter of time before these same things start to happen in the Indian Ocean region, which India very much cares about. So I don't want to call it containment strategy, but it is a strategy aimed at maintaining the current rules-based system, transparent system, a system that protects sovereignty of nations, and the global order of things. And that really is what the Quad is about. It's about four powerful maritime democracies and trying to maintain the current status quo, and not allow countries like China, like Russia, to upset that order and status quo. So if you want to call that containment, I guess you can, but I think the preference is to talk more about maintaining the rules-based order.
Joe, let you have this curveball. Why do you think Modi did not meet Trump? That's the question that was asked. You think that what are the repercussions? Is it normally world leaders just stay away from, especially in a hot election cycle? We know that didn't happen when Prime Minister Netanyahu met Trump, but that of course is a different kettle of fish altogether. So if you want to, take this curveball, go ahead.
I see it as a curveball. I think former President Trump and Prime Minister Modi have a great relationship. We all remember the famous Modi-Trump bear hug. I think, Lisa, you probably there seeing it real time. So they've got a great relationship, and that was his decision. And certainly our president right now is President Biden, and so I wouldn't read into it too much at all. I think Prime Minister Modi is going to have a great relationship with our next president, whoever he or she may be, and I wouldn't read too much into him not meeting with President Trump during this visit.
Right.
I would just add to that I think, perhaps the Indian government felt that unless he could meet both candidates, presidential candidates, that maybe meeting one and not the other was not the way to go. And for whatever reason, perhaps a meeting with Kamala Harris was not organized. So that's the way I looked at it, that, he doesn't want to become an issue in our election campaign. India, being a fellow democracy, completely understands the sensitivities therein. So unless he could meet with both of the candidates, it didn't probably seem right to just meet with one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's sort of the consensus. Samir, I'll let you have this one because just some numbers for you. It says the Quad leaders have met 6 times, 4 times in person. Quad foreign ministers have met 8 times. The country representatives, including ambassadors, have met on several occasions. But the commerce and the industry ministers have just about not yet met in a Quad setting. And this is very apropos right now, given Minister Goyal is visiting the United States and meeting, Secretary Raimondo, and he's going to meet USTR Catherine Tai. And given a recent foreign policy article touched on how commerce has sort of got a very Pentagon overview right now of security under Chips and Sciences Act, isn't the commerce sort of framework, a meeting of the commerce minister and secretary, a bit overdue?
Maybe. I don't really know. That's a good question. Not really sort of my area of expertise. I mean, I do think that these things are happening at bilateral levels, right? And so at a bilateral level, you have AUKUS, which is engaging in a number of action, or trilateral level, really, actions that are sort of in the emerging technology and export control space, which is sort of under the purview to some degree of commerce. And with US-India, you also have similar efforts underway, both with INDUS-X and ISET, but also sort of a strategic trade dialogue that is also engaging India through Commerce Department on export control. So maybe what you're suggesting is a novel idea sort of for the future of some of these conversations that are sort of happening on a bilateral level to be fused into a multilateral domain. I think that's a good aspiration as you want to sort of have like flatter and sort of more dispersed supply chains and technology partnerships that are across the Quad partners. I think, though, that we still have to sort of solve our bilateral ones first, and to sort of prove it's a proof of concept before we can get to that multilateral kind of like free trade zone or sort of export free control zone in the future. But it's a good idea, I think, down the road. It's just we still have a number of steps to get there before that. And just to backtrack for a second, it's important to like remind everybody why we have these export controls. They seem like they're constantly encumbrances and hindrances, but they're done for the purpose of countries who want to protect, including the United States, that wants to protect its most sensitive technologies from leaking to the hands of adversaries. And we have taken great pains to establish export controls to protect against the dual-use technologies that might leak to China that have now posed a threat to us today. So there's good reason to maintain those but also to modernize them based on sort of the current threat and opportunity calculus.
No, thank you so much, Samir, and Lisa and Joe, and thank you to Vikram, who's, I'll have to convey my regards later as well. No, thank you, and like the Quad, like the Indo-Pacific, we spoke freely, openly, and to all our viewers as well. Thank you for joining, and this really was the brain trust. People who not just study it and have expertise in it, but have worked on Indo-Pacific security planning. So a lot of the fruits of what they worked on in government are seeing now, and will be seen when we see INDUS-X 4.0, the next bilateral visit, the next Quad leaders and Quad foreign ministers meeting. Thank you all so much on making time on a Monday morning, and I really appreciate it. And the good news is this lives in cyberspace. We're going to put it on our YouTube channel for you to view later, and for you to take notes and cite our experts here. Thank you, Lisa, Samir, and Joe, and also to Vikram. Thank you. I really look forward to it. And until the next episode of Indo-Pacific Security Dialogues, that's all from me. Thank you guys so much.